Ramona woke to the dim morning light filtering through the tattered curtains of the old farmhouse, Armani stiff and her mind already tense. The silence of the house pressed down on her like a physical weight. Heavy and suffocating, a silence so absolute it made her heart pound in her chest. She had chosen this remote corner of the countryside for peace, for solitude. After the accident that had taken her husband, David, and left her with a fractured leg and a lifetime of guilt, but the peace she had sought had always been a thin veil over something darker, something waiting. Today, it felt as though that darkness had moved closer. She could feel it in the air, in the way the light trembled against the walls, in the creaking floorboards that groaned under the weight of invisible eyes. Her morning began with the faint creak of the front door swinging open on its own. At first, she thought it was her imagination. The wind? No. It was too measured, too deliberate. And then she saw her. A figure, silent and still, sitting in the yard on the old wooden chair that had always been there. The woman was draped entirely in black, her face obscured, features hidden beneath a heavy shadow. Ramona froze, unsure whether she was seeing reality or something conjured from the depths of her fractured mind. The woman's lips moved slowly, whispering words that seemed to penetrate the cold morning air. Today's the day. Today's the day. The repetition sent shivers racing down Ramona's spine. A sound that was almost hypnotic in its rhythm, like a pulse. Like a drumbeat heralding some inevitable event, Ramona's first instinct was disbelief. Perhaps it was a neighbor playing a cruel prank. Perhaps she had imagined it. But the way the figure moved, or rather, how it seemed not to move, suggested something else entirely. It was too deliberate, too controlled. Its presence was heavier than the air, as if the space around it congealed into a tangible weight, pressing against her chest and pulling at her thoughts. Ramona wanted to call out, to scream, but her throat went dry, her voice caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. She could feel her pulse thundering in her ears, her hands trembling, her legs quivering beneath her. Her children, Taylor and Annie, were still asleep upstairs, and the thought of leaving them alone sent a fresh wave of dread through her. Taylor, 14, had begun to sense the tension too, his face drawn and pale. Annie, only 6, clutched her stuffed penguin as though it were a shield against an invisible threat. Ramona's maternal instincts battled with her own terror. She wanted to protect them, to shield them from what she could not yet name. But even thinking about confronting the figure made her stomach twist in knots. Each step she took toward the kitchen was mirrored by a sensation that the woman was moving closer. Though the yard was open, and nothing should have been possible, shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, leaning toward the figure as if in silent reverence. The kitchen itself was no sanctuary. The fridge hummed faintly, its light flickering in irregular pulses. Cabinets opened slightly, then snapped shut, and a subtle smell of ozone hung in the air. Ramona's mind raced. Was this an intruder? A hallucination? Or had some supernatural force claimed this old farmhouse as its own? She tried to convince herself of logical explanations, but deep down, she knew there was none. She had felt the pull of this presence before, subtle at first, then undeniable. Something was here, something aware of her, something patient. She could almost feel it in the bones of the house, in the floors and the ceilings, in the spaces between the walls. It was observing, waiting, calculating. Her thoughts drifted back to the accident, to the day her life had fractured. David's blood on the asphalt, the sterile smell of the hospital, the relentless hum of machines that both held him and let him go. Guilt coiled around her heart like a living thing, sharp and suffocating. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see the scene play out, the impact, the flashing lights, the helplessness. And now, the woman in the yard, sitting perfectly still, seemed to feed on that guilt, drawing strength from her grief. Ramona's breath came in shallow gasps as she realized the connection. This was not random. This was her torment made visible, dark echo of everything she had tried to suppress. Taylor's voice broke through her reverie. "Mom, she's back." Ramona turned to see her son staring out the window, his expression pale and stricken. Annie's small hand reached for hers, pressing the stuffed penguin into her palm. Ramona felt the weight of responsibility pressing down, heavier than fear, heavier than the house itself. This presence, whatever it was tethered to them now, and she had to confront it. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Ramona stepped out onto the porch. The morning air was crisp, tinged with something metallic like the smell of blood before a storm. The woman did not move but seemed to exude a silent command, the air vibrating subtly, drawing Ramona forward against her will. Her heart hammered, but she forced herself to walk, each step deliberate, each step an act of defiance. She reached the edge of the yard and stopped, keeping her gaze locked on the figure. "Who? What are you?" She called out, her voice trembling despite her efforts at strength. The figure tilted its head slightly, a movement so subtle it could have been imagined. "Today's the day," it repeated, the cadence both monotone and suffused with menace. Ramona felt a shiver crawl up her spine. This was no ordinary threat. This was a presence that understood fear, that could manipulate it, that thrived on it. And worse, she knew instinctively it was patient. It would wait. It had all the time in the world. Her mind raced. She considered calling the police, but the thought of explaining this to anyone seemed absurd. Who would believe her? Who could? No, she had to face this herself. For her children, for herself, for the faint, fragile hope of reclaiming her life. She dug into her memories, her emotions, her pain, trying to find a source of strength. And then she noticed tiny details that the presence left behind in its wake. Footprints in the damp soil that vanished upon closer inspection. A faint chill that lingered in the air, the subtle vibration of the chair beneath the figure. As if it were anchored somewhere beyond the visible world, Ramona realized that she had to confront it. Not with weapons, not with logic, but with presence, with awareness. With the full recognition of her own fear and her own strength. Each step she took closer to the figure was a battle against her own trembling. Her breath came in measured bursts. Her mind focused on nothing but the woman and the dark energy radiating from her. When she was only 10 feet away, the woman leaned slightly forward. Ramona could feel her gaze, not with eyes, but with some deeper perception. A psychic pull that probed her soul, sifting through memories, grief, and guilt. "Who are you?" Ramona demanded again, louder this time. The woman did not answer with words. Instead, the yard seemed to react. The wind shifted. The shadows stretched and elongated. And the air thickened with a pressure that pressed against Ramona's chest and made it hard to breathe. It was alive, aware, and it was testing her. The figure rose, slowly, deliberately, stepping down from the chair. Its movements were fluid, almost gliding, and every step seemed to blur the line between the natural and the supernatural. Ramona's stomach turned. Her children were still inside, oblivious for now, but she knew that the moment this entity sensed vulnerability, it would strike. She remembered David's last words, whispered from a hospital bed she could never forget. They were words of hope and warning intertwined, a reminder that life is fragile, that moments are fleeting, that courage must be seized. Ramona summoned every ounce of that memory, every fiber of her being, and planted her feet firmly on the ground. She raised her hand slightly, not in surrender, not in threat, but as a declaration. She would not succumb, not today. The woman's eyes or the void where her eyes should have been seemed to acknowledge this resolve. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then, with a sudden, almost imperceptible movement, the figure retreated a step, as if recognizing that the game had changed. Ramona exhaled slowly, the tension in her body releasing in small increments, but her senses remained alert. She knew this was only the beginning. This presence would not vanish, not entirely. It had marked her, her home, her children, and she would have to learn to coexist, to defend, to survive. The sun began to rise higher, the shadows stretching and retreating in an endless dance. Ramona stood in the yard, watching the figure dissolve into the morning mist. Feeling the cold brush against her skin like a whisper of warning, she turned back toward the house, heart still racing, mind still sharp, knowing that whatever lay ahead, she had taken the first step. She had faced the presence, She had seen it, felt it, and survived its initial test. But deep down, she knew the true confrontation was yet to come. One that would demand every ounce of courage and sanity she possessed. And with that thought, she stepped back inside, closing the door behind her. Her mind already racing through strategies, plans, and the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. The house was silent now, or at least it seemed so. Ramona moved slowly through the hallway, each step measured, her ears straining for the faintest sound. The children were upstairs, their soft breathing a fragile reminder of what she had to protect. But even in that silence, she could feel the presence of the woman in the yard. A pressure at the edges of her consciousness, a whisper of inevitability that clung to her like a shadow she could not shake. Every instinct screamed that the figure had not truly left. It was waiting, biding its time, feeding on her awareness, on her fear. On her every heartbeat, she reached the kitchen and glanced at the window facing the yard. Nothing, only the mist, curling around the gnarled branches of the old oak tree, swirling as though it were alive, a living thing that responded to the woman's will. Ramona's pulse quickened. She knew somehow that the woman was always there, sometimes seen, sometimes unseen, but never gone. And tonight she realized the entity would not be content with observation. Tonight, it would make its move. The hours crawled. Ramona tried to maintain routine, checking on food, tidying up the scattered remnants of her life. But every action was overshadowed by an almost tangible sense of being watched. She could feel it in the floorboards, in the walls, in the air around her. She had learned early on that ignoring it did no good. Pretending it did not exist only made it bolder, more intrusive, as though it could sense denial and contempt as weaknesses. She tried to breathe deeply, focusing on her children, imagining their soft smiles, their laughter, even though the memory of their absence filled her with dread. And then, just when she thought she might gain some sense of control, she heard a soft scrape from the yard outside, a sound so deliberate it could only be intentional. Ramona froze. She could not move, could not speak. Every muscle in her body tensed as she peered through the window. The figure was there, standing at the edge of the yard, watching. Not moving, not speaking, simply waiting. But the sense of threat was palpable, radiating outward like heat from a furnace. She felt it in her chest, in her stomach, a burning awareness that she had to act, that she could not remain passive any longer. She was no longer the frightened widow, immobilized by grief. She was something else now, a mother, a survivor, a woman forced to confront an unnatural terror that had infiltrated her home and her mind. She left the kitchen and moved toward the basement, where old furniture and boxes from a life that felt like a previous existence were stored. She rummaged through the boxes, searching for anything that might give her a sense of protection. A heavy flashlight, a metal rod, her husband's old hunting knife. Each object offered some small comfort, a tangible connection to reality. And yet, the deeper she searched, the more she felt the woman's gaze penetrating even here. Following, waiting, anticipating. Every sound in the basement, the creak of a floorboard. The whisper of dust felt amplified, a message from the darkness itself. Hours passed, marked only by the dimming of the afternoon light. The figure did not retreat. It lingered in the yard, still and patient, as if confident that sooner or later she would falter. Ramona tried to speak to it, to assert her own will, but words felt impotent. The woman's presence was not something to reason with. It was something to endure, something to survive. And as night approached, Ramona understood that endurance alone would not be enough. Confrontation was inevitable. The first subtle attack came just after dusk. Ramona was in the living room when she noticed the shadows behaving unnaturally, stretching longer, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed almost alive. The air grew colder, so cold that her breath came out in visible puffs, though the thermostat read normal. Then came the whispers, faint but insistent, circling her, filling the room with a language she did not understand but that resonated deep in her soul. Her hands shook as she tried to steady herself, tried to reassure herself that this was temporary, that it would pass. But it did not pass. It never passed. Taylor and Annie stirred upstairs, their unease palpable even through the walls. Ramona ran to their rooms, checking on them, feeling their tiny bodies against her own, trying to shield them from the intrusion that had invaded their lives. Annie clutched her penguin tightly, as if it were the only defense against the encroaching darkness. Ramona whispered reassurances she did not feel herself, trying to project strength she did not entirely possess. Yet even in these brief moments of connection, she felt the pressure of the woman, the weight of its focus, drawing closer. Preparing for something inevitable, the woman appeared at the doorway without warning, stepping through shadows as though they were liquid, bending space to her will. Ramona barely had time to register her presence before the air itself seemed to resist her movement. Thick and viscous, like moving through water. The figure's eyesore, the deep, impossible void where eyes should be locked onto hers. A shiver ran down Ramona's spine, but now it was coupled with a surge of determination. She would not allow this creature, this manifestation of grief and guilt, or whatever supernatural force it represented, to claim her children or her sanity. She grabbed the knife from the basement, feeling its cold weight in her hand. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a symbol, a line drawn in the sand. The figure moved closer, silently, deliberately, gliding across the floor in a way that defied all logic. Every instinct screamed to flee, to run to the children, to abandon the confrontation. But Ramona stood firm. She felt the energy of the house respond, the old beams and walls vibrating subtly, aligning with her resolve. She was no longer alone. The woman may have drawn power from fear, but she had drawn power from defiance, from life, from the raw, unrelenting will to survive. The confrontation escalated. The shadows in the room grew darker, twisting into impossible shapes. Walls bending slightly, as if reality itself were a living, pliable thing. The temperature dropped further, frost forming on the edges of the windows. Ramona's breath came in sharp bursts, her mind struggling to comprehend the unnatural phenomena surrounding her. The woman moved with uncanny speed, peering in different parts of the room without any discernible motion, always facing her, always watching, always waiting. Ramona's mind raced. Was this a single entity, or a manifestation of her own psyche, projected outward by grief and trauma? She could not tell. Logic had no place here. Only survival, only presence, only the relentless assertion of will. Hours blurred into a tense, nightmarish continuum. Ramona found herself speaking aloud, reciting fragments of memory, pleas, warnings, prayers. You will not take them. You will not have me. I am here. I am present. I am alive. Her voice grew stronger with each repetition, echoing through the old farmhouse, resonating with the very walls. The woman paused, just slightly, as if momentarily unsettled. But then it pressed forward, its very essence pressing against her soul. Challenging her resolve, Ramona realized then that this was more than a confrontation. It was a test, a ritual of endurance, a battle between the consuming power of grief and guilt and the tenacity of life itself. Her body ached, her limbs trembled, yet she held firm. She called for her children, guided them to the living room, placing herself between them and the entity. Annie clutched her penguin tighter. Taylor's hands trembled, but they were there, witnessing, surviving, drawing strength from their mother. And Ramona understood she was no longer just protecting them physically. She was standing as a bulwark against despair, against the supernatural manifestation that sought to overwhelm them. Time became meaningless. The house itself seemed suspended in some liminal dimension where night and day, reality and illusion coexisted uneasily. Ramona's senses were overwhelmed. Sight, sound, touch, smell, all heightened to a painful degree. She could feel the woman's attention like a physical force, probing, testing, circling her mind. And yet, with every challenge, she found reserves of strength she had never known. The knife in her hand, the penguin in Annie's grasp, the mere presence of her children all became instruments of focus, conduits of survival energy. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure hesitated. Its movements slowed, the relentless pressure easing just slightly. Ramona seized the moment, advancing with deliberate steps, asserting her will, refusing to yield. The woman's voice, or the echo of it, whispered again, "Today's the day." But now Ramona's response was immediate, defiant. "Not today. Not ever." The words resonated, a declaration that seemed to ripple through the house, through the air itself, through the very fabric of the night. The entity, for the first time, wavered. It was not defeated, far from it, but the dynamic had shifted. Ramona had demonstrated a presence of will that it had not anticipated, a force of life and defiance that created a temporary balance, a fragile stalemate. She exhaled, exhausted but unbroken, knowing that tonight was not victory, but survival. And survival in this context was all that mattered. The first light of dawn crept through the windows, pale and tentative, dissolving some of the shadows and giving Ramona a brief reprieve. The woman's figure retreated slightly, fading into the edges of perception, but she knew it was not gone. It never would be. The farmhouse, the yard, her very life had been marked irrevocably. And yet, for the first time in months, Ramona felt a flicker of control, a glimmer of hope. She had endured. She had faced the presence, and she had survived. Dawn broke with a fragile light that barely pierced the oppressive shadows lingering in the farmhouse. Ramona stood at the threshold of the living room, exhausted but alert, feeling the weight of the previous night press against her like a tangible force. She had survived the initial confrontation, held her ground against the unnatural presence that had haunted her yard. But deep inside, she knew that survival was only temporary. The woman in black, or whatever entity had claimed her home, had marked her, had imprinted itself into her reality. Every corner of the house, every creak in the floorboards, every shadow cast by the morning light reminded her that this was far from over. Taylor and Annie stirred quietly, their faces etched with the same mixture of fear and awe that Ramona herself felt. The children had witnessed the unearthly events of the previous night, and their innocence had been scarred by the encounter. Annie clutched her stuffed penguin tightly, her small fingers digging into the worn fabric as though it could shield her from the unseen horrors. Taylor, older but no less shaken, stood beside his mother, trying to muster a semblance of courage. "Mom, is it really gone?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Ramona bent down, resting her hands on his shoulders, meeting his gaze. "Not gone," she admitted quietly, "but it's not here, not right now, and we have each other." The house itself seemed to breathe along with them, the subtle hum of its aged beams and walls vibrating in response to the tense calm. Ramona moved carefully, scanning each room as though expecting the figure to materialize at any moment. The woman in black had become more than a mere intruder. She was a reflection, a shadow, a living manifestation of grief and guilt and fear that had found purchase in the cracks of Ramona's psyche. Yet for all the horror she inspired, there was a strange order in her presence, a predictable rhythm that Ramona had begun to notice. She realized that understanding the entity was her first step toward survival. Fear alone would not suffice. Ramona decided that to reclaim her home, she needed more than awareness. She needed strategy. She moved to the kitchen and opened a drawer, pulling out pens, notebooks, and a small camera she had long forgotten. If the woman in black existed in some dimension that overlapped with their reality, Ramona reasoned, then perhaps documenting her patterns, her movements, her appearances, could provide clues. She began to take meticulous notes, recording every detail she could recall, the exact positions, the timing of the whispers, the chilling repetition of the phrase, "Today's the day." Her hands shook, but her mind was sharpening, focusing like a blade honed by fear and necessity. The afternoon sun had barely risen when Ramona heard it, a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, echoing from the yard. She froze, heart hammering. The figure had returned, its presence subtle, yet undeniably close. Ramona gripped the knife she had kept since the basement, though she knew it was symbolic rather than functional. The entity moved differently now, more deliberate, almost testing her limits. It appeared at the edge of the yard and then vanished, as if mocking her, playing a silent game of cat and mouse. She could feel its power in the air, a pressure that seemed to weigh on her chest and suffocate her with each breath. This time, Ramona decided she would not merely react. she would confront. She stepped outside, the grass cold beneath her bare feet, and faced the yard squarely. The woman emerged from the shadows with a fluid motion, gliding rather than walking. Her face remained obscured, features hidden in darkness, yet Ramona could feel the intent behind every movement. She felt the pull, a psychic tug that reached into her mind. Dredging up memories of the accident, the hospital, David's bloodied eyes, and the crushing weight of guilt that had followed her for months. "You won't have us," Ramona said. Voice steady, despite the cold fingers of fear clutching her heart. "You won't take them." "You won't take me?" The words were more than a declaration. They were a lifeline, a tether to reality, a refusal to yield. The woman paused, tilting her head as though considering the weight of Ramona's will. And then, with a movement faster than the eye could track, she lunged. The air itself resisted, thick and viscous, making Ramona's movements sluggish, but she held her ground. She had learned from the previous night, had studied the entity's rhythms and patterns, and she used that knowledge now. The figure circled her, a predator, a shadow that twisted reality with every step. Ramona dodged instinctively, her mind firing on every cylinder, sensing where the entity would appear next. The yard became a battlefield of wills, its very air charged with tension and unseen forces. Taylor and Annie watched from the doorway, frozen in fear. But even as they trembled, they drew courage from their mother. Annie clutched the penguin tightly, holding it as though it were a talisman. Taylor's eyes followed his mother's every move, absorbing her strength. Understanding that courage was not the absence of fear, but the determination to act despite it. Ramona realized that direct attack would not destroy the woman in black. Physical force alone could not overcome a being so entwined with the supernatural fabric of the yard and the house. She had to use her mind, her awareness, her understanding of the entity. Closing her eyes for a brief moment, she concentrated on her love for her children. On the memories of David, not as guilt, but as inspiration, on the life she still had. She felt an inner light, fragile but persistent, radiate outward. The figure paused again, sensing the shift. Recoiling subtly, as though it were encountering resistance it had not anticipated. Opening her eyes, Ramona stepped forward boldly. "You are not real," she said. Or perhaps she told herself that. "You exist only because I allow you to. You are part of my fear, my guilt, my grief, and I am stronger than you." The shadows around her seemed to convulse, twisting unnaturally, but her resolve held. She continued, voice unwavering, recounting memories of resilience. Moments when she had survived before, when she had chosen life over despair, hope over surrender. The woman in black faltered, her movements jerky now, less fluid. Ramona seized the opportunity, advancing steadily, maintaining eye contact, maintaining will against will. The psychic pressure was immense, threatening to unravel her sanity. Yet she pressed forward, a beacon of determination in the swirling darkness. For the first time, she sensed uncertainty in the entity, a recognition that it had underestimated her resolve. Suddenly, the yard fell silent. The mist that had clung to the corners dissipated, curling upward and vanishing as though expelled by some unseen force. The entity's presence, while still palpable, seemed weakened, diminished, constrained by the strength Ramona projected. She felt her heart rate stabilize, her breathing slow, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to hope. But the confrontation was not over. Ramona knew this presence was a permanent mark on her life, a shadow that would linger. Testing, challenging, reminding her of vulnerability and strength. She turned back toward the house, gathering her children in her arms, holding them close, letting them feel her heartbeat, her presence, her resolve. The woman in black receded to the edges of perception, watching, waiting, but no longer advancing. Ramona understood that victory, if it could be called that, was temporary, fragile, and dependent on continual awareness, on courage maintained over time. The morning sun brightened, bathing the farmhouse in a pale golden light. The shadows retreated further, the house's creaks and groans returning to their natural rhythm. Taylor and Annie began to speak softly again, the tension in their small bodies easing as they realized the immediate threat had passed. Ramona, exhausted yet resolute, knew that they had survived a trial unlike any other. One that had tested the limits of mind, body, and spirit. She allowed herself a moment of reflection, acknowledging the terror, the danger, the supernatural forces at play, but also recognizing her own resilience. The woman in black was not gone. Perhaps she never would be. But Ramona had reclaimed her home, her children, and her sense of agency. She had faced the darkness, endured it, and emerged still standing. And in that fragile victory, there was a lesson. Horror may linger, shadows may encroach, and fear may persist, but strength, courage, and love could carve a space in which even the most malevolent presence could be held at bay. Ramona led her children inside, closing the door gently behind them, the warmth of the house contrasting with the chill of the yard. She held them close, whispering reassurances she hoped to feel herself, reminding them and herself that even in a world where darkness waited at the edges, there remained light, life, and hope. And as she looked out the window one last time, catching a fleeting glimpse of the mist curling around the distant oak tree, she understood that survival was not the end, but a promise to continue, to endure, and to never allow fear to dominate her life again. Never allow fear to dominate her life again.